It sat there, raw, red, and trembling slightly, like it still remembered what it meant to be alive. A tongue, severed, freshly removed, glistening under the low flicker of candlelight. The table beneath it was old oak, stained with wax and carved with symbols no one remembered how to read anymore. But they kept using the table, again and again. I was standing no more than 5 feet away, knees buckled beneath me, the cold stone floor biting through the linen at my legs. My mouth was still open, hollow, where sound used to live. I didn't scream, I couldn't. That was the point, wasn't it? A man in brown robes muttered something in Latin I didn't understand. Another held a book, leather-bound, with pages that smelled of damp guilt and centuries of wrongs. The woman beside me had a shaking jaw and eyes like dead mirrors. Her lips quivered, not in prayer, but as if still trying to form the word why. But no one asked questions anymore, not after dark. Not after the third time they heard voices behind closed doors, voices that sounded human but not quite. They said the devil spoke through dreams, and if he needed a tongue, then taking it was salvation. I still remember the moment before the blade came. It wasn't the pain, it wasn't the fear, it was the quiet, the exact pure silence that filled the room before they made me silent forever. That silence was the loudest thing I've ever heard. And now that tongue, they say it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the devil. It started with a child, 7 winters ago, in a village tucked between 2 black hills and a forest so dense no sunlight dared to enter. A boy named Elias began speaking in his sleep. At first it was gibberish, slurred words, breathy muttering. His mother dismissed it as dreams, harmless things, the kind that come and go with fever or nightmares, but soon he began saying names, names of people long dead. Names no child should have known, the butcher who drowned in the flood, the midwife who'd hanged herself in the steeple. The names came at night, whispered in voices that weren't his, deeper, older, hollow. The villagers told themselves it was a fluke. A coincidence, but then it happened again. Another child, then an elder, then the blacksmith's wife. People all across the valley began to murmur in their sleep words they never remembered saying, in always the same pattern. Strange languages, unknown names, prophecies of fire, water, blood. Some woke up with scratch marks on their necks, others with tongues bitten nearly through. One man tried to gouge his own eyes out after a night of sleepwalking through the graveyard. The church arrived in the 5th month, hooded men with crucifixes that swung like pendulums and faces as cold as iron. They said the devil had found a new gate, not through spells or witches, but through the unconscious mind, through dreams. And so the sermons changed. Sleep became a sin, to rest was to risk possession, and those who spoke in their sleep were no longer just victims, they were accused. The rule was simple. If someone heard you speak while unconscious, you were marked. They carved symbols above your door. The baker's house burned first. They claimed she cried out Lucifer's name in the middle of the night. Her husband swore it wasn't her voice. He was right, but it didn't matter. No one slept for more than a few hours at a time. Mothers held their children upright through the night. Men drank bitter roots to stay awake. They walked the streets in pairs, watching, listening. The town's silence at night was unnatural. It was the silence of fear holding its breath. And when someone slipped, when the fatigue took over and they began to mutter, there were consequences. Tongues, always tongues. Because if the devil used your tongue to speak, then removing it made you pure again. At least that's what they told themselves. They called him Brother Merk. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even ordained. Just a man with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. But in a town so lost in dread, authority didn't always wear a collar. Merk had taken it upon himself to organize the night watch, a group of villagers who would patrol the streets, sit beneath windows, and listen for signs of demonic intrusion. He kept a journal, every twitch, every whimper, every suspected word that escaped a sleeper's lips. He wrote it down with the zeal of a man who believed he was saving souls, not documenting madness. On the 3rd Sunday of Lent, Merk rang the church bell before dawn. No one rang that bell unless there was a death, and no one dared question him when he called an emergency mass. The townspeople gathered in the frost-choked nave. They were hollow-eyed from sleeplessness, their bodies brittle from weeks of half-rations and fear. Merk climbed the pulpit not with fire, but with something stranger. His hands trembled, his voice cracked. "I need to confess," he said. There was a pause, quiet and thick, like the breath before a scream. Then he told them what had happened the night before, how he dozed off outside the miller's home just for a moment, but it was enough. He dreamed. In the dream, a woman stood at the edge of a black lake. Her eyes were crows, her dress soaked in mud, and when she opened her mouth, every voice he had ever silenced poured out. Tongues, real and spectral, spiraled around her head like a crown of ash, and she spoke to him not with hate but with pity. "You cut what you feared," she whispered, "but fear grows back." When Merk awoke, he was screaming. He told them he had made a mistake, that this wasn't possession, that maybe, just maybe, it was guilt, trauma, a sickness of the mind, not the soul. The villagers didn't take it well. The old priest stood up slowly and asked only one question: "Did you speak in your sleep?" Merrick hesitated, and in that hesitation he was condemned. They took his tongue that very night. He didn't resist. But what shook the village most wasn't the punishment. It was the moment before they silenced him, when Merrick smiled, not with madness but with mercy. "You'll see," he mouthed through the blood. "You'll see what's really speaking." And then silence. They say that silence is peace, but in that village, silence had become something else entirely. It didn't soothe, it waited, heavy and watchful, like something alive, like something holding its breath. After Brother Merrick's punishment, the night watch disbanded. No one volunteered anymore. They feared the sleep, feared the mouths of their neighbors, feared the fragile line between accusation and confession. People stopped speaking at night. Families whispered prayers into cupped hands. Mothers taught their children to clench their teeth before bed, to bury their faces into their pillows if they dreamed. But the dreams worsened. More and more villagers began to wake up with blood on their tongues, not from biting, but from something else, something more precise, like something had touched them. They couldn't explain it. They couldn't remember what they'd said. All they knew was that each morning felt thinner than the one before. The world was unspooling, and then came the sound. It started with the dogs. They refused to sleep indoors. They'd scratch at the doors, whining, eyes wide with a terror no one understood. Then came the wind, except it wasn't wind. It was a sound like humming, but low, wrong, like something pressing against the walls of the world. The villagers called it the hollow choir. They said it came from the chapel. At first, they thought it was echoes from the crypt, stones shifting under frost, but it was rhythmic, like breath. Like hundreds of voices all sighing at once, just beyond hearing. You couldn't quite understand the words until you did, and when you did, you couldn't unhear them. They were names, their names. People began boarding up their homes, some fled. Others tried to dig up the graves behind the chapel, hoping for some explanation. But the ground was untouched, no signs of burials, no signs of rest. One man, Thomas the blacksmith, tried to record the sound. He sat in the chapel with a wax cylinder recorder, alone. What came back wasn't the humming. It was a child's voice whispering the same thing over and over. "You took what we said, but not what we meant." That was the final straw. Thomas left the village that night, muttering that he'd rather be deaf than dream in that place one more time. He wasn't seen again. It happened on a night without stars. No wind, no birds. Just a blackness so thick it felt like the sky had been smothered by something ancient. That night the bells rang, not the ones in the chapel tower, those had rusted years ago. No, this was deeper, lower. Like something old and buried had finally decided to speak back. The first to hear it was an old woman who lived near the chapel. She screamed so loudly that the entire village woke. They rushed to her house thinking she'd been attacked, but found her on the floor, trembling and weeping, her hands clutched tightly to her chest. When they pried them open, they found it, a tongue, dried, cured, and still warm. By morning, more villagers had found them, tongues beneath pillows, tongues in drawers. One was wrapped inside a child's drawing of a house. Another was pinned to a door with a nail that hadn't been made in centuries. And each of them, each grotesque, shrunken thing, bore a symbol carved into its base, a spiral that bled into a cross, like speech twisted into silence. The village gathered in the square, panicked. They brought the tongues and burned them in a pit, thinking it would end the curse. But the next night, the bells rang again, and the tongues came back, only this time they were speaking, not in words, not exactly, but in sounds that felt familiar, like lullabies your mother once sang or warnings she whispered when she thought you were asleep. The tongues writhed when they were touched, moaned when placed in light, and screamed if brought too close to the chapel. The villagers tried to leave, but the roads twisted, maps failed, compasses spun. It was as if the village had been swallowed by itself, turned inward, folded like a jaw snapping shut, trapped. Some said the tongues weren't returning, they were never gone. They were buried beneath the floorboards, sewn into the walls, dissolved in the communion wine. And worst of all, the children had begun to speak again in their sleep. But it wasn't their voices, it was the hollow choir, clearer now, louder, closer. The chapel had long been closed, locked not by key, but by fear. Even the most pious villagers dared not enter. Its doors were warped, its stained glass windows coated in soot, and its altar sagged like a spine bent from too many whispered sins. But that morning it stood open. No one had seen it happen. No creak of hinges, no splintering of wood, just open, as if it had always been waiting. Inside, candles burned that no one had lit. Dozens of them flickering on every pew, along the cracked tiles, around the pulpit. And there, draped in robes that shimmered like oil and bone, stood a man no one recognized. Or rather, a thing wearing the shape of a man, but the longer you looked, the less human he seemed. He spoke without moving his lips. The sound bloomed inside the villagers' skulls, not through ears, but like thoughts borrowed from something older. He preached not of salvation, but of silence, of a holy void where speech was sin and noise was defiance. We took their tongues, he said, though again no sound escaped his mouth, but they learned to speak with their blood. He gestured to the altar. Upon it, writhing and bound by nothing, were the tongues, hundreds of them, stitched together like a tapestry, each one twitching, gasping, crying in a language no one knew but everyone felt. The villagers dropped to their knees, some wept, some laughed. One man began to claw at his ears until they bled, desperate to unhear what he could not understand. The children, those born after the silence began, stood still, not frightened but transfixed, as if they'd been waiting for this sermon all their short lives. And then, as the candlelight dimmed, the chapel sang, not music, not song, something beneath it, a resonance that rattled bone, that made old guilt rise like bile. The chapel sang in the voices of those who had died without ever being heard, women, children, the accused, the exiled. Their pain became praise, their agony liturgy. The sermon ended not with a benediction, but with a single gesture. The preacher raised his hand, pointed to the bell tower, and the bells, silent for decades, rang once more. But it wasn't metal, it was bone. They led me to a smaller cell, one without a window, without air, without even the distant sound of bells that used to remind me time still moved beyond these walls. The priest walked behind me, holding a small silver cross close to my back as if it might shield him from whatever I had become. I didn't speak, I couldn't speak, but I could think, and that perhaps frightened them even more. In this room, silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. There were no books, no visitors, no light except for the slit beneath the iron door where shadows came and went like ghosts. The walls were made of stone, but they pulsed in my mind like they were breathing. The cold seeped into my spine like a memory I hadn't asked for. I began to wonder if this was still punishment or a kind of mercy. Had they locked me away to break me or to keep the world from me? Time collapsed in that space. I lost count of the days. Maybe that was the point, to erase all sense of self, to reduce me to something obedient, something afraid of speaking even in thought. And yet I dreamed more vividly than ever. In my sleep, I saw the faces of others, women, children, men, silenced for less than what I had done. I saw dreams turned into confessions. I saw fears planted like seeds, watered by prayer and grown into shackles. When I woke, the silence screamed louder than any accusation. I could no longer remember the sound of my own voice. I had nothing left to say, and still they feared me, because deep down they knew you can take a voice. But you can't kill a dream, and it is in dreams that truth survives. There's something strange that happens when you've been silent long enough. The world outside begins to speak for you. They started saying I had visions, that even without a tongue I whispered secrets in the dark, that I smiled at shadows, that my silence was more dangerous than any scream. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't, so I wept instead, the kind of weeping that doesn't reach your eyes, only your bones. I became a myth, a warning passed between candlelit corridors. Mothers warned their daughters not to speak in their sleep. Young priests turned their heads when I passed. The silence they forced on me became a mirror they couldn't look into, because it showed them what they truly feared: doubt. You see, I wasn't the devil's mouth. I was their own conscience echoing back at them, and they couldn't stand it. At night, in that quiet stone box, I began to hear voices not from hell, but from memory. My mother's lullaby, my brother's laughter. My own voice, timid and young, reciting prayers I didn't yet understand. These were not curses. They were remnants of a self they tried to erase, and every time they returned, it was proof that I still existed, that I still mattered. They thought they had stripped me down to silence, but silence is never empty. Silence remembers, and sometimes silence resists louder than sound ever could. One day they brought someone new. He didn't wear robes, didn't carry a rosary. His fingers were ink-stained, not blood-stained, and when he stepped into my stone world, he didn't kneel, didn't cross himself, didn't look away. He looked at me. Really looked, not at the scars, not at the silence, not at what I lacked, but at what was left. At first, I hated him for it, for seeing. I had grown used to the fear in their eyes, the way they rushed past as if even my breathless mouth could curse them. But he lingered. He placed a chair across from me and sat, no parchment. No candles, just a tiny, cracked pocket mirror which he laid gently between us. At first, I turned away. I couldn't bear to see what I had become, but the mirror wasn't for me, it was for him. And as he looked at his own reflection, he whispered, not to me, not to himself, but into the silence as if it were sacred. They told me you were touched by demons, he said, but all I see is what they couldn't destroy. He came back every day after that. Sometimes he read to me, sometimes he said nothing at all, but always he left the mirror, until one day he didn't return, just the mirror, and a note, it read, when they silence your voice, they forget your silence can still witness. Let it. They thought silence was an end, a punishment, a closing of the story, but they forgot something important. Silence listens, and silence remembers. It remembers every cry muffled behind stone walls, every child who bit down on their own screams to survive, every word stolen before it had the chance to be spoken. And when silence has seen too much, it begins to take shape. At first, it was just a feeling, a shift in the room when I entered. Eyes that once mocked now refused to meet mine. A priest dropped his candle during evening prayer when he turned and found me standing behind him, unmoving. Another stuttered mid-sermon when I passed through the chapel door. I never laid a hand on them. I never had to. They began to fear what they had created, not because I was evil, but because I was still alive. Alive without begging. Alive without reciting their verses. Alive without the tongue they took from me. Alive and watching. I started leaving things behind, a single feather placed on the altar, a burnt piece of parchment with a drawing of a woman standing in fire, silent but unbroken. A mirror left on the bishop's bench, cracked just like the one he once gave me, but this time reflecting their own faces, not mine. They say ghosts haunt with chains, but I learned how to haunt with memory, not to hurt, but to remind, because when they silence you and you survive, your very breath becomes a rebellion, your presence becomes a sermon, your gaze becomes a flame, and silence becomes a weapon, one they can no longer control.